The Impossible Revolution. The year is 1776. The colonies have declared independence on paper, but paper does not stop cannonballs. Washington arrived in New York City with a mandate from Congress to defend the town. It was a suicide mission. New York is an island city, surrounded by water, the perfect playground for the Royal Navy. In the summer of '76, the Empire struck back. It wasn't just an army. It was an invasion force, the likes of which North America had never seen. Over 30,000 professional soldiers, German mercenaries known as Hessians, feared for their brutality, and a fleet of warships so vast that observers said their masts looked like a dead forest, stripping the leaves from the trees. Washington stood on the heights of Manhattan and watched them come. He had never commanded a large army before. His troops were farmers, shopkeepers, and boys shoeless, sick, and terrified. They had no uniforms. They had no bayonets. They were facing the greatest war machine on the planet. The collision happened in August, on Long Island. It wasn't a battle. It was a butchery. The British outflanked Washington. They used the terrain against him. The Americans were slaughtered in the open fields. Washington watched from a fortified hill as his best troops, the Marylanders, were cut to pieces trying to buy time for the rest to escape. He was heard to say, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." The revolution should have ended right there. Washington was trapped against the East River. The British fleet was behind him. The British army was in front of him. All the British General Howe had to do was wait for the wind to change, sail up the river, and crush the rebellion in a single afternoon. But then, the Washington luck returned. A thick, supernatural fog rolled in. It was so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Under the cover of this miraculous gray blanket, Washington orchestrated one of the greatest escapes in military history. In total silence, he ferried 9,000 men across the river to Manhattan. When the sun rose and the fog lifted, the British charged the American lines only to find empty trenches. The fox had slipped away, but escaping is not winning. For the next 3 months, the war became a fox hunt. The British chased Washington out of New York, across the Hudson River, and into New Jersey. It was a humiliation. Washington's army began to dissolve. Soldiers deserted in droves. They threw down their muskets and walked home, convinced the cause was lost. Washington's temper, usually held in check by an iron will, snapped. At a place called Kip's Bay, when he saw his men running from a small British landing party without firing a shot, he threw his hat on the ground and roared, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" He sat on his horse, frozen in a trance of rage, refusing to move while British musket balls whizzed past him, until his aides had to grab his bridle and drag him to safety. By December 1776, the Continental Army was a ghost. They had shrunk from 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000. They were starving. They were dressed in rags. You could track their movement through the snow by the bloody footprints left by their shoeless feet. The British considered the war won. They went into winter quarters, leaving a garrison of Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey, to keep an eye on the dying rebellion. Washington retreated across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The clock was ticking. On January 1st, the enlistment contracts for most of his men would expire. The army would legally cease to exist. Washington wrote to his brother, "I think the game is pretty near up." He needed a miracle. Or, more accurately, he needed a gamble. Washington looked at the map. He looked at the river, and he decided to do the one thing military strategy says you should never do: attack a superior force. In the middle of winter, at night, across a frozen river. It was Christmas night, 1776. The plan was madness, a three-pronged attack. But the weather was so atrocious, a hurricane of hail and snow, that two of the three columns turned back. Only Washington's group kept going. We know the famous painting, Washington standing heroically in the boat. The reality was darker. It was pitch black. The river was choked with massive blocks of ice that could crush a boat hull like an eggshell. The wind howled like a banshee. The men were huddled together, shivering, trying to keep their gunpowder dry. Washington stood on the bank, watching the slow, agonizing process. He knew that if this failed, he would be hanged. The password he gave for the operation was grim and simple: victory or death. They landed on the Jersey shore at 3 a.m. They were hours behind schedule. They still had to march 9 miles in a blizzard to reach Trenton. 2 men froze to death on the march, but they kept moving. At 8 a.m., they crashed into Trenton. The Hessians were caught completely off guard. They tried to form lines, but their muskets wouldn't fire in the storm. The Americans, fueled by months of humiliation and rage, charged with bayonets. It was over in less than an hour. Washington had captured nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers. He had lost almost no one. It was a stunning, impossible victory. The news spread like wildfire through the colonies. The fox bit back. The psychological impact was massive. Men who were packing their bags to leave re-enlisted. New recruits flocked to the cause. The French, watching from across the ocean, raised an eyebrow. Washington had not won the war that would take 5 more years of hell. But on the banks of the Delaware, he had saved the revolution from extinction. He proved that a ragtag army of free men could defeat the hired guns of a king. But as the adrenaline faded, Washington looked toward the winter sky. He knew the hardest test wasn't the British army. It was the cold, and the darkest valley was still to come.